For more on this story, then, we are joined by the Fair Trade Tobacco Association spokesperson, that's Sinenhlanhla Mnguni. Sinenhlanhla, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. So tell us why you are going to court over this matter. Your application is in two parts, and part of that, the first part, is about getting a record of the voting record in as far as cabinet decisions were concerned. Are you concerned that the decisions around the prohibition of tobacco and its products was not arrived at lawfully?
Look, what we're saying, thank you for having me on the show, is that the two conflicting announcements which were made by the President and the Minister of Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs give rise to a sense of confusion and create the impression that there is not a united government in our fight against the virus is concerned. What we have stated is that, in our papers rather, is that the decision that was made by the President on the Thursday would have been founded on some sort of basis and some sort of consultative process. Now, part of the documents which we request is the basis or the foundation for the initial announcement by the President, and why, if there was still need for further consultation, that decision, which was, or rather that announcement, which was unequivocal by the President, was made in such haste. I heard earlier on you reporting that the President had announced earlier this morning that he had consulted with the NCC prior to reversing the ban, but surely our contention is that the NCC would have been consulted on the very same basis prior to the President's initial announcement. So that is one of the angles that we will be looking at in as far as our legal application is concerned.
So is it your sense then that there's inaccurate reporting of how the decision was arrived at? For example, when a minister like Tito Mboweni says, I supported the lifting of the ban on cigarette sales and I was outvoted, you don't believe that there was actually a process by which the majority of members of that National Command Council were in favor of keeping the ban in place?
Look, we do not dispute that there may have been some sort of process where a vote may have taken place, but what we're saying is that we are not, we do not have particularity or clarity as to what was factored in as far as the decision that was made. Now, we have, as the Fair Trade Independent Tobacco Association, as well as many other associations which are industry representative bodies, tried to engage government throughout this lockdown period without any sort of keenness from government to engage industry and other relevant stakeholders. Now, that is obviously problematic when decisions are taken which govern or concern our industry, and we are not able to make submissions, or our submissions are not at least considered. So we are trying to, in essence, create a bit more transparency in and around the decision-making in relation to the lockdown period. I mean, you would recall, for instance, that Chief Justice Mogoeng stated prior to us going into lockdown that courts need to remain open for decisions which are made by the executive to be taken on some sort of legal challenge should any party feel aggrieved about how they
Fast forwarding to part of the your arguments in the second part of your papers there, Sinenhlanhla, you are basically the word essential goods features quite a number of times there. Essential goods, cigarettes, really?
Look, I can hear what you're saying there, but what we're stating is that if you look at firstly, the Disaster Management Act, it does not explicitly prohibit the sale of cigarettes. It is quite clear in as far as alcohol is concerned. Now, the drafters of the regulations would have been aware of that, and that is why cigarettes in the first two or three drafts of the regulations were not explicitly excluded. And now what we stated, and this is something that we intended going to court on prior to the President's announcement, is that the term essential goods is divided into 5 subcategories, one of which is basic goods. Now, the Act nor the regulations do not define basic goods. Now, when you look at, for instance, the Consumer Protection Act and look for the definition of this, it states that anything which is fit for human consumption. We must also remember that in South Africa, what is basic to you is not necessarily basic to another party. So Smokers, for instance, and this is something we touch on in our papers, are currently being affected due to the withdrawal symptoms associated with nicotine. You will not believe some of the correspondence which we have received, which has been voluminous, from smokers complaining about the psychological impact that the ban has had on them.
Lastly, Sinenhlanhla, because of time, I see that at paragraph 30 of your papers, of your notice of motion, you talk about Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma and make reference to her history as the former Minister of Health, under whose watch there was, comprehensive legislation around the tobacco industry, and some of the statements that were then later resurfaced and have been reported again recently. She's second respondent, if I'm not mistaken, in terms of your papers.
That's correct.
Why do you feel you need to single her out as a person? You've seen the debate around that. Are you targeting her in particular? Is she particularly responsible for you being aggrieved?
No, not at all. We're not targeting the minister in her personal capacity. This is something that is obviously put into the papers as a form of background to in essence, further amplify the reason why we are dealing with that particular issue. So there is no personal attack on the minister. The matter is dealt with in a capacity as a nominated official and a member of cabinet who is tasked with regulating these regulations.
All right, Sinenhlanhla Mnguni, thank you so much there. He's been telling us about those court papers that have now been filed to try and get government to lift the ban on cigarette sales.